Okay, my name is Pat Simone from Fresno, California, the San Joaquin Valley. Today I am speaking with Katie, an academic from Fresno State Agriculture Department. She is a expert in the poultry industry.
All right. My name is Katie Tarrant. Originally, I'm from Murphy, Texas, which is a suburb outside of Dallas. I was raised participating heavily in FFA and 4-H. I did a lot of rabbits. And I went on to get my undergraduate and my master's degree in biological sciences in Sam Houston State. I originally thought I wanted to be an ag teacher, but somewhere along the way, I started becoming interested in doing research. So I teamed up with a faculty in the biology department and started doing some research on rabbit skeletal morphology. Wow. And I very much loved what I was doing, but towards the end of my master's, I thought one day I need to get a job, and I don't think this is going to be it. Yeah. So I ended up going to the University of Arkansas for my PhD. My degree is in cell and molecular biology, but my focus was definitely in poultry. And I made the jump there because at the heart of what I had done in FFA and what I had done in my research in my undergraduate and my master's was looking at how people have manipulated genetic selection in the animals that we care for to achieve certain traits. And within rabbits, those are going to be mostly traits that are for cute, fun to look at. Yeah. Oh, yeah. But in a industry like poultry, those traits are definitely going to be emphasized on the economic side of things.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. So with my PhD, I ended up doing research in a disease that is associated with genetic selection in broilers, trying to identify genetic associations with that particular disease.
Right.
And when I was at the U of A, I saw a job posting for a assistant professor tenure track job at Fresno State. And I applied for it because it was my dream job. The job did a little bit of teaching. It did a little bit of research. There was a broiler house on campus, the Foster Farms Education Research Facility, where the students get hands-on experience in commercial settings. Right on campus, with just steps away from the classroom. And I thought that would be a perfect fit for me and my interests. So I applied, and I was fortunate enough to be selected for that position. At this point, I am an associate professor in the animal science and ag ed department. I am the sole poultry scientist on campus. So anything poultry related, whether that's research curriculum or poultry science club, all that falls under my umbrella.
Yeah, you're the poultry expert.
I am the poultry expert.
Yeah, I see that.
Yeah. So it's a little bit unique. There are a couple of poultry science specific departments in the US where there are several poultry specific faculty. But at our university, I fit into the animal science department where we have other folks with specialties in different species, and I cover the poultry aspect of that.
Absolutely. Yeah, let me, it's funny you say the market of poultry and everything, and I wrote down some notes. I did a lot of research. Poultry market's a lot bigger than I thought it was.
It's
a lot big.
Enormous.
Oh, yeah. It was like 92 pounds. USDA says Americans will eat 92 pounds of chickens per year per American. I mean, 8 billion, that's 8 billion chickens. Then in the beef industry, it's like every American will eat like 210 pounds of beef per person. It's amazing. California just alone produces 2.5 annually, and I think 40 billion overall in poultry. I mean, it's just the industry is huge. I was really amazed at how big it was. So you're doing, you're right there. What is the history of your industry? I mean, as far as academics, how does that work? Is it 100 years old? Is it,
When you say from an academic perspective,
as far as
I mean,
experimentation, genetics and everything.
well, okay. So Henry, maybe the seventh, something like that, very long time ago, had a slogan of a chicken in every pot. So at the time, several hundred years ago, chickens were a little bit more on the rare side. They were dual purpose type birds where they produced both egg and meat from the same, effectively, we would call a breed. And ultimately, there were a lot of changes, especially in the Northeast US in the early 1900s, that really set the foundation for the explosion of the industry as we know it today.
Sure.
So ultimately, during a time of rationing, especially during World War II, where several families were posed to limit their consumption of red meat, typically poultry was not always a part of that rationing, or folks could raise poultry easily in their backyard, whereas red meat was a little bit more difficult for the average American. So in the 30s and 40s, there really started to be a lot more producing of these birds. And in Delaware, there a woman by the name of Cecilia Steele basically set up the first large-scale poultry production scheme.
Now, where was that?
So she was raising 500 birds, slaughtering them, and able to sell them, rather than being in a homestead situation where you're raising exactly what it is that your family is eating.
Excellent.
So from there started to be an explosion in the number of birds that were produced every year. And one of the big events that really helped create this great foundation of what we have is something called the Chicken of Tomorrow contest. It is basically a convention that brought together a lot of minds in poultry, so people who were producing birds. And it was a forum where people could discuss factors like genetics or nutrition, management practices, and would have competitions on who could raise the largest bird. Now, in that time period, there was definitely a main focus of let's increase the size of the bird, because if we sell based off of poundage, the larger the bird, the more money we can make.
Right, right.
So initially, largely in the 50s and 60s, there was a great emphasis on increasing the size of the bird. So we're effectively taking parents that are going to be larger in size, we're going to breed them and hopefully produce offspring that were larger than the generation before.
Gotcha.
Now over during that time period, USDA started to get involved with creating regulations on producing their.
Now, when did the USDA do that?
Man, I'd have to look at.
I mean, you can guess.
Between like the 50s, 70s, something like that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. And closer to the 70s, 80s, there started to be a switch to where instead of focusing on a single trait to select for example, live weight, we can imagine the selection being like spokes on a wheel. So there are a number of different factors that contribute to having a high quality product, specifically when we talk about a broiler or meat chicken. And while of course live weight can get us to a higher level of profitability, if that bird has a higher rate of mortality, if it has a higher rate of lameness or diseases, if it has a low rate of hatchability of its offspring or low fertility, that is going to tear apart our scheme, even if we're producing a large size bird.
Right.
So it became critical to include a number of different selection aspects into these genetic selection programs to ensure that the birds were of high quality, but were also sustainable. I think I should mention also probably, early to mid 1900s, we're looking at a shift in breed specific emphasis. So my area of expertise is definitely on the broiler meat chicken side, but
that's the big industry too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But several decades ago, there started to be a shift where it was determined that if we select for live weight or meat yield in a particular bird, we notice that other traits can suffer, like number of eggs laid, hatchability, and that sort of thing.
Right.
But when we have a market for needing to produce eggs, it would be beneficial to have a breed that could sustainably produce a large number of eggs.
Sure.
And it just so happens when we select for these egg quality traits or egg numbers, we get a bird that is a lot smaller in size. So we started having divergence of some really common industry breeds that are used that go into the egg production side, for example, the white leghorns versus the broiler side, like our Cornish rock crosses.
Sure. Yeah. Broilers is a big, I was looking at the numbers, and broilers was the big number,
Yeah. So I mean, 2020, it was over 9 billion broilers produced in the US.
Yeah.
It's an enormous number, especially when you consider like that's the USDA numbers. That doesn't include worldwide.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. That's USDA I was looking at, but yeah, that and beef, but I could not believe it that people eat that much chicken. I mean, I do myself, but I couldn't believe it. And that's where, that academic acumen comes in that you have, So do you work with Foster Farms on a partner basis, or how does that work actually with them?
Yes, we do. So Foster Farms is a huge supporter of our program, or the poultry program within the department, but for the university as a whole. But specifically with our department, the Foster Farms helps us oversee a contract facility on our campus.
Oh, they're on your campus?
Well, in a sense. So effectively, Fresno State owns a commercial style broiler barn.
Okay.
And the equipment inside it. And we work within the vertical integration that's seen throughout poultry industry, where we are the contract farmer. So ultimately, Foster Farms will hatch the broiler chicks and will put them into our barn.
Okay.
And then from the point that those birds are in our barn until the time that they get shipped out to a Foster Farms processing plant, they are under our care on a 24-hour basis.
Okay.
So that, when I say our care, I do want to mention that means that it is our students who are taking care of those birds, meeting a number of different industry standards, welfare-wise and production-wise, but through the supervision of Foster Farms. Now, we do get a little bit more hand-holding than a typical facility would that acts as a contractor for a vertical integrator. Typically, the vertical integrator will just come at the end, and if you to pick up the birds, if you have any questions, they'll help answer. Yeah, but part of our relationship is Foster Farms is providing a hands-on opportunity for our students.
Sure.
And it's training those students. So our students are leaving the university with a enormous amount of knowledge and experience beyond what many universities are able to provide. Right. And so we have management from Foster Farms on site at our facility multiple times throughout a single flock to go through and advise students, to help make sure that everything that we're doing is keeping up to date, and to provide that mentorship that really does make our program valuable for our students.
I was reading about that, and it was really impressive. So they're raising, well, they're boring them for you, and then you're taking them and you're doing your care, right, for them, more or less. Then they come at the end and pick up what you cared for, correct?
Correct.
Okay. In layman's terms.
Yes.
But there's a lot in between, I know. There's a lot in between there.
Correct.
How is the poultry industry tackling the well-being of the chickens? Is there as far as diseases and everything, do these chickens, because I was looking and there's so many diseases, do they get that from humans, or how are they transferable, or I have
Well,
no idea.
in a way, you could say that they get it from humans, but not in the way that we would spread a cold from one person to another.
Okay.
One thing that we have to keep in mind is the broiler chickens that we are raising are similar to their genetic ancestors, the jungle fowl, but they are different in a number of ways, which includes their physiology and their ability to live in a little bit more extreme of an environment.
Right.
So the birds that we've genetically selected are living in environments that we control. So we do a lot of work to make sure that we are keeping those birds at the ideal temperature and humidity throughout the entirety of their life. So what part of the problem can be is if people spread diseases from one ranch to another. They can bring diseases from the outside on their shoes or on their body. And ultimately, that can have devastating effects. So when we think about diseases like avian influenza, which about 5 years ago was having a very, we were undergoing a very difficult time with that in the Midwest. Ultimately, the best thing that we can do for the bird's well-being is making sure that we are taking care of biosecurity. So it is critical to us that we ensure that we, as the caretakers of these animals, are not exposing them to any diseases.
Right.
One way that we would do that is we have protocols that prevent us from moving between different populations of birds over a certain number of hours. Some facilities have requirements for showering in to get into the facility or showering out when we're dealing with breeding colonies.
Wow.
In a facility like
that at your, excuse me, did they do that at your facility?
Our facility, no, but when you have a breeding facility, that can be very common.
Okay.
Or when you have a facility with birds that are of a particularly high value, that are at a pedigreed or great grandparent level. And I know that those are a little bit technical terms that would take a little bit to describe, but ultimately all birds that are being raised within the poultry industry undergo great scrutiny with their biosecurity program. Wow. So at minimum, we limit the movement of people coming into our facility who have been in contact with birds, whether that's domesticated or wild. Wow. We wear gear that can help prevent any kind of transfer off of our bodies. So that would be a full body suit, hairnets, that may include gloves, masks, extra booties, depending on the facility that you're at. Right. There are washing stations where you get your tires washed, or you wash and sanitize your shoes before you go in. So there are a number of different aspects of meeting biosecurity protocols to ensure that we are producing a bird that is healthy, but is also safe. But one of the things that you have to think about, because I mean, I'm sure that this might sound extreme, especially with expertise in a different industry. Sure. But we are dealing with a large number of birds, so about 20 to 40,000 birds within a single barn. Yeah. So when you start getting sniffles on one side of the barn, I mean, you can see them on the other side within 24 hours. You have a pretty intense spread. Yeah. So because the birds, and that's one of the other biosecurity things I do want to mention real quick is the facility that our birds are kept in is an enclosed facility. So the birds don't have access to outside. And part of the reasoning for that is they limit their access to wild birds or rodents who could bring in those diseases to ultimately, hurt the birds that we're caring for. Wow.
That's amazing. I mean, it really, I had no idea it was that complicated. I mean, I used to have Zaki Farms. You may be familiar with them. And they were good customers of mine. And I remember going in there, and I had to walk through, they had a little plate there full of like ammonia and water and stuff to desanitize my shoes, and take off all my stuff. And, every time I went into a certain section, and that was a big thing, was disease. and not spreading it, cleaning my hands, and all going through the net, the whole protocol. And I was like, every time I had to go over there, I had to go through all that. And I never understood that it was that technical and that much of a big issue, and disease could travel that quick.
And, it's a different setup. So if you have a cattle facility, you have one individual who gets sick, the economic investment in that one individual is quite great. And the numbers that you're dealing with on a single facility could be, a few hundred to a couple thousand. Sure. So the ability to quarantine that one animal from all of the other animals makes sense. And the lifespan of that animal is long enough where it makes sense that you would want to quarantine that animal so it can still benefit your production scheme over the next year and a half.
Right.
For broilers, we're typically for fast growth broilers, which makes up the largest segment of broilers produced in the U.S. We're looking at less than an 8-week production period.
Wow.
So that is from day of hatch to the day that the bird is sent to the processing plant. So in that short period of time, it becomes quite difficult to quarantine a single individual. Yeah. So when we start seeing illness, and typically because there's such a large number of birds, when we first start spotting illness, it can be a few birds in an area rather than just a single one. But to get ahead of it, when we treat animals in the facility, we'll treat them all.
Right.
So, of course, that comes at an economic cost because Sure. You're not just treating one, you're treating 20,000. So, the dollars definitely rack up, but to ensure that those birds are as healthy as possible. And I mean, if we're talking about an animal that ultimately is providing something for us, to be a good steward of those animals.
Absolutely.
Ensure that, they're at their top production value that they possibly could be. It's incredibly important that we make sure that we take care of them. Yeah. So ultimately, anything that we do within the poultry industry, any one change we make or any one type of medication that's given or any, 1 ounce of grain that's increased in the amount of feed that one bird is eating, when you multiply that by 20,000 for one barn, or you multiply that by 9 billion that are being produced in the US a year, that's incredible, amounts of money that is going in. So it's to our benefit to make sure we take care of those birds as best we can.
So do you have you probably have video and 24-hour monitoring and all kind of sensors and stuff?
So, so within industry, it's very typical to have a number of different sensors throughout the house.
Yeah.
And from an industry-wide perspective, these can include temperature sensors, humidity, pressure within the tunnel ventilated house, lights, water. There are some facilities that have 24-hour CC cameras going for certain purposes. There are some that use it for research purposes as well, but that is going to definitely depend on the location of that facility and then which company is running that facility and what their protocols are.
I was really interested. I read about heat and spike proteins in birds. Is that correct? I mean, the warmth provides a protein in them. Maybe I'm not sure. I mean, you may want to clear that up.
That's something that I can't really speak on.
Yeah. I was reading about, because I do a lot of sauna and stuff, and it builds spike proteins up in muscle and everything. And I was reading about they were starting to experiment with spike proteins and heat in chickens and stuff. So I don't know. I thought I'd throw that through. I don't know.
Well, I mean, when that particular subject matter isn't something that I could speak on, what I can from a production standpoint is heat stress can be a serious issue.
There you go.
And so that's something that we definitely need to mitigate. We know the exact temperature that one of our birds needs to be in order to be comfortable. But when we start adding in fluctuating humidities, moisture content throughout the air, wind speed that the birds are experiencing. It can get a little complicated. So the students that are in our facility are trained to know what temperature those birds should be at, but they also know that every bird acts as their own sensor. And unless you go in that facility and take a look at each of those birds and identify what behaviors they're displaying, it's really impossible to know if they're comfortable or not.
Right.
So constant monitoring is critical to making sure that we are keeping those birds as comfortable as possible.
Now, do they have to cool off these facilities? Because it gets 115, in the valley. At times, do they have to cool off, or do they use blowers, or how does that go?
So typical facilities would use what are they called? I'm drawing a blank. The water curtains.
Okay.
So basically large swamp coolers.
Swamp coolers, yeah.
Yeah, there we go. That'll bring in the air, and because it's the air is directed out a single side of the house, so we have a single directionality that the air is moving over the birds. Yeah. And when we wet those cool cell pads is the correct term. But when we wet down the cool cell pads, it can bring the temperature down a significant amount. So we bring in air that's being cooled through an evaporative cooler. Right. And then we are pushing it at a high temperature through those, a high rate through those birds. And that helps in cooling down the birds as well. There are some facilities that may use misters to help provide additional cooling capacity.
Yeah, I've seen those. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, a dehumidifier or whatever, but that's amazing. I mean, all the care that's given and all the science and everything. So are you teaching remotely now? You're to the students, and how does that work now?
As of right now, I'm teaching remotely. It's definitely been
a challenge,
a strange couple of years.
Yeah.
But the students during the peak of COVID, when the university was on a low population level to reduce the number of in-person classes, that definitely presented a problem for many of the lab classes that we have within our department.
Sure.
So the Department of Animal Sciences at Fresno State prides itself on giving hands-on experience and practical application to the livestock and poultry industry to our students.
Well, that's
and I think that, and I think that really helps show industry that we can help develop students who are going to be highly productive because they've had that type of training. They're not going into a job thinking, well, I've never done something like that before. I've never got my hands dirty.
Yeah.
I thought I was going to be a manager behind a desk all day. Oh. So, our students it was hard on the students to go to this different modality of teaching or of instruction. Of course, like everybody else has experienced, some hardship during that time. There were a number of different methods that folks in our department used to try and illustrate hands-on methods as best as possible. Some of the faculty used webcams. I think one of our faculty attached a webcam to his hat and walked around an animal unit
in the facility.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
That's
what
smart.
They were doing.
Yeah.
For my class in particular, I thought that it would be great to give an idea of what industry was doing during that time, but also to provide some maybe professional development for the students. So I had a large number of guest lecturers, more so than I usually am able to accommodate because everybody was operating fully on Zoom. Yeah. So we could have a number of people from industry who zoomed into my class, who talked to the students about how their companies were taking on COVID, but we're also talking about other things that students might find relevant, such as how did that particular industry member transition from an undergraduate program into a job? Right. Or how does that particular industry member deal with working as part of a team or group? How do they work as a supervisor? How do they act as a good supervisee? And providing some soft skill development for those students.
Now, let's go to your students. Do you have students from all over the world, or is it mostly Midwest, California? How does that, because Fresno State's big in agriculture, they're high up there. Yeah.
Now, our typical student is from the Central Valley.
Okay.
We do a lot to serve our particular region. So the majority of our students are probably within an hour or two drive of Fresno State.
Oh, okay.
We do have students that come in for one of a number of our programs, specifically within ag. So we have a top-notch dairy program.
Oh, yeah.
We have a livestock judging team that has done very well over the last several years. So we have students who are coming out of state to go to certain programs specifically.
Sure.
But our largest goal is to serve the students who are in our region.
Right. Now, I don't know how this works, but as far as veterinary, is this a part, is your classes a part of being a veterinarian, or I have no clue.
So within our department, there is a number of different emphasis a student can enroll in, and one of those is pre-vet. Okay. So we have a employed veterinarian who is working as an active vet in the field right now, who acts as a lecturer in our department, Dr. Gail O'Bannon. Okay. And Dr. O'Bannon brings her experience as a real life veterinarian into the classroom. And she teaches a couple of courses that are specific to students who are interested in going to vet school, such as anatomy and physiology. But Dr. O'Bannon also oversees the pre-vet program and advises the students in that program to make sure that they are doing the best that they can to prepare themselves for vet school. So some of the courses that we have are going to be required by all students in our department. So I teach animal genetics, and every single student, pre-vet or not, has to take animal genetics.
Wow.
And then a class like poultry, that would be an elective. So students can choose which type of species that they would like to explore further and take classes within those species. So in some cases, I do have some pre-vet students who are interested to go into a poultry class.
Sure.
And I have to say that being a vet in the poultry industry is a great job to have.
I know.
Companies are scrambling to pick up qualified poultry veterinarians.
Yeah.
So if students are going to be a vet, I definitely try and emphasize the future landscape of what a poultry vet has as possibilities for their career path, because it is quite extensive.
Yeah, that's what I hear. I hear there's a big need for poultry vets. Now, how do you interact with USDA?
Most of my interaction would be like with California Poultry Federation.
Okay.
Pacific.
They're a long-term federation. They're like 100 years old or something like that, I think.
Oh, are they?
Yeah. I was reading about that. I thought, God, they've been around a long time. Yeah, they're one of the largest ones, I think. Mm. Yeah. What else are you involved with outside of, are you involved with any other growers or anything like that? I guess you call them growers.
So or vertical integrated companies. Foster Farms has really been our partner through everything. So they're typically, they are the company that supports us the most.
Oh yeah.
We have had students who have graduated and gone on to other companies besides Foster Farms.
Sure.
So there are, companies like Zoetis, Elanco. We've had them go off to Cargill, Tyson. Pittman Farms, which is local, Petaluma Farms, Central Valley Egg. There are a number of different places that our students end up, and that comes down to a number of different factors. And sometimes that's geographical location students are interested in, whether they're interested in going a live production route or going sales, whether they're interested in laying hens versus broilers. All that would contribute into ultimately where they would end up and what companies they're pursuing. Though we do have a annual conference called International Production Processing Expo. It's held in Atlanta, Georgia every year, and it's a really cool setup because they have a college student program in which they bring in 40, 50 companies who conduct interviews on site for both internships and jobs. Wow. So schools take, busloads of kids there. I say kids, they're all adults. So
yeah. Kids too.
Yeah. Busloads of students there.
Yeah.
And those students can go through 10 interviews within a 3-day period. Wow. And can walk out of an interview with a full-time salaried with benefit job contract signed.
That's terrific.
And the U.S. Poultry Foundation identified the importance for keeping the students who are trained in poultry within the poultry industry. So they have definitely gone to a lot of lengths to ensure that there are events to help promote and encourage students to follow a path within the poultry industry, because Sure. It is plentiful. And there's a lot of money in it, and there's a lot of chickens that need to be raised.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's enormous. Now, what does it take to get into your program coming out of high school? I mean, what do kids have to have as far as GPA or classes, or, what's involved in that?
I mean, for Fresno State specifically, those guidelines are going to fluctuate every year.
Okay.
And I think typically a student will identify which degree program they're interested in pursuing. Typically, once a student comes into animal science, they will start out by taking Animal Science 1, just an introduction class to all animal sciences, where they're presented information on a number of different industries. And then from there, if students don't have previous experience or desire to go into a certain species of emphasis, that's where they really start trying to identify what resonates with them and what Sure. they think they want to do. So specifically for the poultry program, our minimum requirement is a desire to learn and an ability to be a professional.
Absolutely.
So our program, like many of the others, does not have any prerequisite of you've had to have had chickens before. You've had to have seen a chicken before.
Yeah.
We can provide everything, which I think is a really interesting parallel with the industry, who are bringing in new hires every year from graduate or undergraduate programs. And that's most of these employers, most of these big names, they don't have to have seen background of you having extensive poultry experience.
Sure.
It comes down to your willingness to want to participate in this type of environment, your ability to take in information and to learn from it, and your willingness and ability to be able to treat those animals with care, because that's definitely a really important part of our industry. So our program definitely reflects that. Everybody who wants to join is welcome.
Yeah.
And we do have a number of events that we partake in that hopefully encourages students to, want to stay long-term with our program. But things like that include conference travel. So going to California Poultry Federation or the IPPE conference that I talked about previously, being able to participate as a volunteer or an employee at our Foster Farms Education Research Facility, getting that one-on-one mentoring with Foster Farms employees, that's always a really big draw.
Yeah.
We have several other events we do. Sometimes we go on tours of facilities throughout California that are poultry related. So it could be laying hens, turkeys, etc. So we do a number of things to try and promote recruitment, but also to promote education of the students who are in the program.
Yeah, from what you say, it's very extensive. And if I was an employer, it's a no-brainer, from what you teach. And people, like you said, you want to have a will to work. That's a big issue after taking the academic classes. How big, how many students are there usually in your classes? How big is your class?
So typical animal production classes in my department are about 24 to 25 students.
Yeah.
And they're fairly, they're small to moderate in size. But when you were dealing with trying to manage students in animal facilities, which all of our production classes have labs, there are a number of different dangers that are present that we have to make sure that we're capable of having a number of students we can actively monitor.
Yeah.
So the limitation of those classes is definitely due to things that would go on in the farm. So for example, we have a meat science class. So when we have students who are in our meat processing facility, there are a number of, there are knives. There are some dangers there. So it is incredibly important that, those threats could be potentially mitigated. When you have large animals and students around large animals, that can be an issue. When you have small animals like chickens, and we have to make sure that because we follow a very extensive welfare protocol under Foster Farms, all of the students have to abide by it, whether or not that's the way that they were raised to handle an animal. It's how we have to raise them in our facility.
Yeah.
So, trying to monitor and ensure that we are meeting those guidelines set by Foster Farms is definitely incredibly important.
Wow.
With those students.
Yeah, I am thoroughly impressed with you and, all your protocols. It's unbelievable. The average person, they wouldn't know this at all, unless, they seen you and talked to somebody or visited the campus, I would imagine. Do they have visitations where people can come in and see what's going on or anything like that? Or
well, our department does run farm tours, and that is typically for grade school children. There are occasions where there are tours for non-grade school children as well. In general, that is a wave at the poultry barn and then walk very far away by it because of our biosecurity regulations and the number of protocols that have to be met about what have you been doing for the last 72 hours. So that kind of limits what our ability is outside of students who are in our classroom and the employees that we have. But you touched on something that really resonates, I think, with the agriculture industry as a whole right now. And that's most people don't really know what goes into this.
Education.
So, and I think that is, that's a really hard pill to swallow.
Yeah.
I think that well, it's not that I think, there are hundreds of thousands, millions of man hours that have gone into each of our animal production systems to figure out what is the best way to raise these animals. How can we meet the needs of our population? How can we meet the needs of the well-being of those animals?
Absolutely.
Yet there's a large part of the population who does not know what we're doing, does not know why we do the things that we do. And, to some extent, industry could be to blame if you don't make it absolutely transparent. 30 years ago, like if there's not a need to make you feel like you have to explain every little detail, then it might not be something that we've been really good at being transparent about in the past.
Right.
But in addition to that, I think that really illustrates the importance of an ag education, specifically in high school, where we know that most Californians would be able to receive that type of education.
Absolutely.
Just so that people know where their food is coming from and that they understand what it means to be in one of these industries or to produce one of these animals, or the confinements that we have, constraints that we're under to be able to meet the needs of the consumers.
Yep. Excellent. Yeah. This whole podcast is based on your food doesn't come from Costco and Walmart. All right. It doesn't. It comes from the farmers. It's hard work, really hard work. It's a lot of academics are involved, and a lot of money out of their pockets are involved. And in a snap of a finger, you could lose a whole, bunch of chickens. It's an unbelievable how much you have to monitor them, so people can eat. So that's my biggest forte of this whole thing. I found the niche of people they need to understand about and respect the farmers and what we do and the amount of money we spend and the risk we take. So is there anything else before we cut out that you'd like to say?
Yeah. So real quick, the area that I'm most interested research-wise is trying to find this intersection in making sure we are looking at new ways to meet the needs of the birds for their well-being, but also considering the economic impact to the consumers for that. Okay. So I do want to mention that the way that certain things within the poultry industry or any industry work might be convoluted from the outside. However, there's a reason that they're done the way that they are. And as I had mentioned before, any small change could result in millions of dollars of economic impact. And that impact ultimately goes to the consumer.
Absolutely.
So I think it's important to mention that the typical person in the poultry industry is not looking to stay stagnant. It is a constant search of how can we be better? How can we be better for our birds? And how can we be better for our consumers? And I think that's really important to emphasize because I think sometimes it gets lost.
Excellent.
One of the things that I do want to mention is when we make those management changes, ultimately, we could be pricing people out of certain food markets. So when we increase the amount of input, whether that's time or equipment that we're putting into the system, the consumer is the one who pays. And I feel like there are many people out there who we could consider to be elite eaters who get to choose what type of protein they'd like to add to their diet because they are not constrained monetarily and they have the funds to do so. But I think it's equally important to mention, especially coming from the Central Valley, where Fresno State is. And I do want to mention that this is something that I hadn't considered before I got to Fresno State. So it really opened my eyes. But as a side note, I believe it's about 50% of our student population is food insecure. So they do not know where their next meal is coming from. So that means if I employ 10 students out at the poultry unit, if we make a very small change that impacts the price of the chicken that we're producing, potentially 5 out of those 10 students couldn't afford the birds that they're caring for.
Wow.
So when we think about it like that, I think it's fair to say that this is a balance. We do want to make sure that we are providing the best situation that we can for these animals. Absolutely. And with that, we also need to make sure that everybody can choose this type of animal protein in their diet if they need it. Right now, chicken is the lowest cost animal protein, below that of beef or pork.
Absolutely.
So if we add 10 cents per pound for some of us, like in my situation, I'm privileged enough where 10 cents a pound will not make me change my buying decisions. But for some folks, that could be eliminating this nutritious food item out of the dinner table. And, ultimately that's not fair because you are limiting folks on what they're allowed to eat based off socioeconomic status. So it's incredibly important that we as an industry stay focused on moving forward and finding best practices to make sure that we are meeting both consumer and bird needs. And we do that through a number of ways, and largely we do that through research. So academic work, research that's happening at universities is critical for helping industries make choices on how they're going to move forward, and also research that is happening internally within those companies as well is critical to making sure that we create this product that is wholesome, sustainable, and is meeting high levels of animal well-being.
Wow. You know, Katie, you've been a very interesting person, and we are happy to have you. And I hope more people like you are in this industry, because you have a lot to offer.
Well, thank you.
So yeah, it's been a pleasure for me. Please like and donate $5 to $10 to our Patreon account so we can expand this podcast. Thank you.